It was the kind of October morning that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Not quite cold, not quite gray. The sky sat low over the mall like a wet sheet someone had thrown over London and forgot to collect. Tourists shuffled along the railings outside Buckingham Palace with their coffee cups and phone gimbals, breath fogging, everyone waiting for something, though most of them couldn't tell you what. I was one of them, I'll be honest about that. I'd taken the morning off work. Some vague idea about finally seeing the changing of the guard after years of living 20 minutes away and never bothering. My flatmate called it peak tourist behavior. I called it cultural appreciation, and then took the tube anyway. The crowd had settled into that peculiar rhythm crowds always find. This slow, oceanic swaying, people adjusting positions, children hoisted onto shoulders, someone's umbrella perpetually in someone else's line of sight. The gate was maybe 40 feet ahead of me. The guards had already taken their positions. And that's when I started watching him. Not because anything was wrong. Nothing was wrong, that's the thing. Everything was precisely, almost aggressively correct. The guard stood at the far sentry box to the left of the central gate, bearskin hat, red tunic, rifle at his side, the full ceremonial architecture of the thing. He hadn't moved. Of course he hadn't moved. That's the whole point, isn't it? But I watched him the way you watch a painting when you're alone in a museum. That same feeling, like if you look long enough, something might shift. His name, I found out later, was Corporal James Alderton, 26, 4 years in, third rotation at the palace. I didn't know any of that standing there. To me, he was just the guard, anonymous in the way only a man in full ceremonial dress can be, which is completely and on purpose. The crowd noise around me was its own texture. American tourists explaining the history incorrectly to their children. A school group from somewhere in the Midlands, all matching yellow high-vis vests, their teacher counting heads with the frantic energy of someone who'd lost one before and never forgave themselves for it. A Japanese couple photographing each other in front of the gate with the seriousness of a wedding portrait. Normal, all of it normal. Then I saw her. She appeared from the far side of the courtyard, or rather she materialized, the way people sometimes do when you've been staring at one fixed point so long that everything else sharpens. A girl, 8, maybe 9 years old. She was wearing a coat the color of a winter plum, and she was walking, not running, not being led, walking with this self-contained composure that sat wrong on a child that age. Like she'd been taught to move through rooms and had simply never stopped practicing. There was a woman behind her, a few feet back, private secretary type, the closed, careful posture, the neutral expression that's trained rather than natural. 2 protection officers bracketing the whole arrangement at a distance that looked casual and wasn't. They were moving along the interior side of the gate, a private path, not the tourist section. Most people didn't notice them. Why would they? The crowd was watching the guard. I was watching both. The girl slowed as she drew level with the sentry box. She didn't stop, she slowed, in the way water slows before a bend. Her eyes moved to Corporal Alderton with a directness that children have before they're taught not to look at people like that. Unfiltered, assessing. He was looking forward. He is always looking forward. That's what they do. She said nothing. Nobody said anything. The protection officers kept their spacing. The secretary type kept her face professionally empty. The crowd breathed and shuffled and pointed cameras. And then the girl, this small, plum-coated, composure beyond her years girl, gave him something. Not a wave, not a smile. A nod. One slow, deliberate, chin-dipping acknowledgement. The kind of nod you give someone you know, not someone you're performing for. The kind that means I see you and nothing more because nothing more is necessary. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. And Corporal James Alderton, third rotation, 4 years in, trained to be furniture, blinked. Just once, but deliberately. One slow blink, eyes closing and opening like a shutter, a response, A recognition, something that was absolutely not in the protocol manual for ceremonial guard duty at Buckingham Palace. The woman behind the girl reached forward and touched her elbow, the lightest possible contact, barely a graze, the universal language for "we're moving now." They moved. I stood there with my coffee going cold and felt the specific strangeness of having witnessed something I couldn't immediately name. Not dramatic, not dangerous, not anything that would make the news or trouble anybody. Just a small private signal exchanged through iron railings. Just a child and a soldier deciding, in the space of 2 seconds, to acknowledge each other's existence in a place specifically designed to make one of them invisible. I looked around. Nobody else had clocked it. Which made it feel, I don't know why, I still don't, like I'd been handed something accidentally. Like a letter dropped by a stranger that you pick up and have no business reading but read anyway. The crowd kept moving. The guard returned to his iron posture. And I finished my cold coffee and thought about the look on his face when he blinked. Not warmth, exactly. Not sentiment. More like recognition. A soldier recognizing another soldier, even if one of them was 9 years old and wearing a plum-colored coat. Even if only one of them was standing in the cold. The man next to me had a camera lens the size of a thermos flask. He'd been there before I arrived, staked out behind the railing with the territorial patience of a wildlife photographer. Press lanyard, gray jacket, thermos flask that was actually a thermos flask tucked in his bag. He was the kind of person who exists near palaces and sporting events and crime scenes, professional enough to be invisible, present enough to catch things. His name was Derek. I know this because 40 minutes after the blink, we were sharing a bench, and he was showing me something on his camera's preview screen with the hushed urgency of a man who'd found a $5 in a coat he hadn't worn in 2 years. He'd caught it. Not the girl's face. The angle was wrong for that, and the protection officers had done their usual geographic magic of occupying space in ways that blocked sightlines without appearing to. But he'd caught Alderton. A clean profile shot, sharp enough to read the texture of his uniform, and in the sequence, Derek flipped through 4 frames with his thumb. You could see it. The micro-change. The incremental softening around the eyes that preceded the blink. The blink itself. The return to stone. 22 years doing this, Derek said, not looking at me, still looking at his screen. I've got exactly 2 photographs of a guard reacting to something, and both of them were people touching the bearskin hat for a dare. He paused. I've never photographed one choosing to. That word, choosing, it lodged somewhere. I asked him what he thought it meant. He shrugged the shrug of a man who's learned to document first and interpret later, if at all. Means he knew her, he said, or knew of her, enough to make a decision in about half a second and be comfortable with it. That's not instinct. That's, he clicked the cap back on his lens, that's a relationship of some kind. We sat with that for a minute. A pigeon landed between us with the absolute confidence of a creature that has never been wrong about anything. Did you see where they went? I asked. Back inside. He tilted his head toward the far wing. East entrance, probably. They weren't on an official schedule, no announcement, no cavalcade, private movement. Private movement, which meant the girl wasn't there for the performance of royalty. She was just moving through her house, the way anyone moves through their house, except her house had 40 feet of iron railings and several hundred strangers pressed against the outside of it. I thought about that. She'd grown up watching the guards the way other children watch fish tanks, a permanent installation, part of the architecture, but somewhere along the line, at some age, in some corridor, through some combination of observation and whoever she was, she'd made a decision that they were people, not displays, not furniture. And she'd acted on it, quietly, privately, with a single nod, the smallest possible gesture that still constituted gesture at all. Derek stood up, tucking his thermos under his arm. Won't publish it, he said, unprompted. Not enough context, and he glanced toward where the girl had disappeared, not really mine to publish. Then he walked off in the direction of the press gate. I stayed on the bench. The changing of the guard had concluded while we talked. The crowd was thinning now. Tourists were routing toward the gift shop or St. James's Park, the yellow high-vis school group being herded with diminishing success toward a waiting coach. The fresh shift of guards had settled into their positions with the seamless anonymity of shift change anywhere, except that everywhere else, the people going off shift get to be visibly tired. The new guard at the far sentry box was younger than Alderton, sharper jaw, parade ground posture that still had the rigidity of someone proving a point. He stared at a fixed point somewhere above the tree line like he'd identified something offensive in the clouds. Alderton was gone, and I found I wanted to know what he was thinking about, walking away from his post, whether he was thinking about it at all, whether in 4 years he'd learned to let those 2-second moments pass through him without sticking, or whether he was walking through whatever room guards walk through afterward and replaying a nod that lasted a breath and a half. I put my hands in my pockets. The bench was cold through my coat. Here's the thing nobody tells you about moments like this, moments that are private and human and small and witnessed by accident. They don't resolve. They don't land with the satisfying click of a story that knows what it's about. They just sit in you, slightly sideways, and you carry them home on the tube and stare at your own reflection in the dark window of the tunnel and think. She saw him. He knew she did. And for one blink he let her. That's all, that's the whole of it. Some things are complete in their smallness. You don't need to add anything. I went back the next morning. No flatmate commentary this time. I didn't tell anyone. I just woke up at 7, stood in my kitchen drinking tea I didn't taste and decided. Alderton was on the early rotation. I don't know how I knew. I didn't technically, it was guesswork dressed as instinct, the kind you only trust when you've got nothing to lose on it. But there he was, same position, same box. The bearskin hat making him taller than he actually was, the red tunic catching the pale light in that way that always looks slightly surreal against gray British sky. The crowd was thinner at that hour, real enthusiasts and early tour groups only. The haphazard mass of the previous morning had been replaced by something more deliberate, people who'd set alarms. I found a position against the railing. Alderton stood. I stood. That was how an hour passed. The girl didn't come. Of course she didn't come. I knew that on the tube there. I knew it standing at the railing. I was simply doing what humans do after they witness something they can't categorize. Returning to the location. Hopping to catch the context that would help them file it properly. It doesn't work like that. It never works like that. What happened instead, what I got instead of context, was conversation. The man to my right had been there since before me. Late 60s. Wax jacket that had genuinely been through things. He had the easy stillness of someone who'd spent time outside in his life, not for leisure but for work. Farmer's hands, but a tourist's camera, which he held with an enthusiasm that suggested it was new and he hadn't quite worked out the zoom yet. We fell into talking the way strangers do when they're both staring at the same thing. Incremental, non-committal, the verbal equivalent of testing ice. His grandson was in the army. Not London duties, somewhere considerably less ceremonial, he said, without specifying, in the tone that meant he'd said as much as he was going to say about it. He watched the guard with a different quality of attention than the other tourists. Less tourism, more recognition. I mentioned what I'd seen the day before. Carefully, the nod, the blink, I didn't elaborate on the girl. He was quiet for a moment. In the field, he said, they talk about the difference between following orders and following what's right when those are two different things. He was still watching Alderton. Most of the time, good training means they're the same thing. Officers spend years trying to make sure they're always the same thing. He paused. A tourist walked directly between us and the railing, phone raised, and neither of us moved. "But sometimes," he said, "you get a moment where they split, where the rule says one thing and being a human being says another. And the men worth keeping," he smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd watched men for a long time and was comfortable with what he'd concluded, "they find a way to do both. Barely, but both." He took a photograph that probably had too much sky in it. "Sounds like your boy found a way." Your boy, as if I had some claim on the moment, as if witnessing made you partial owner. Maybe it does. I thought about Alderton's training, the 100 protocols that govern that post, how to stand, where to look, when to march, when not to respond, how to handle every category of public interaction from aggressive tourists to medical emergencies, and the very specific categories of things that simply are not supposed to happen at all. A silent acknowledgement from a child of the household. No protocol for that one. Nowhere in the manual. Too small to be dangerous, too specific to be anticipated, too human to be written down. So he'd made a decision. In half a second he'd looked at the shape of the situation and found the smallest possible action that was simultaneously a violation and an act of dignity. A blink. Not a nod, not a word, not a smile, a blink. The human minimum. The man in the wax jacket left around 9:30, tucking his camera away and saying something about a bus he didn't want to miss. We shook hands in the way men shake hands when they don't know each other but have spent time next to each other and feel, at the end of it, that something was real. I stayed another 20 minutes. Alderton finished his rotation, marched away with the crisp geometry of the changeover, disappeared through a side gate with the total completeness of someone stepping off stage. I watched the gate close behind him, and I thought about the girl in the plum coat walking through those rooms every day, learning which hallways echo and which ones don't, knowing which staff members smile and which ones are paid to be invisible, growing up inside something so large and watched and loaded with protocol that smallness, the small gesture, the private moment, the thing that happens in 2 seconds between the railings and gets filed under nothing to note, might be the only real thing she has to offer anyone. She offered it. He received it. Neither of them broke anything that mattered. That's the protocol nobody writes down, the one that exists in the space between the rules, the human agreement, fragile and old, that says, "I am here. You are here." That counts for something even if we can't say it out loud. Especially then. Especially here in this cold, watched, beautiful, absurd place where a man stands still for hours to be part of something larger than himself, and a child nods to remind him that the stillness has a face. I took the tube home. I didn't go back a third time. Some things are better left complete.